Okay, so we'll now move on to the second part of tonight with Stuart's talk. And
thank you. Thanks very much for the invite. Stuart Kirby, I'm Senior Lecturer at Lancaster University in the Law School. So I've only been there for 7 years, so the more astute of you will notice that I probably had a career before that, and I was 30 years with Lancashire Police. And I only wish I understood criminology then as I understand it now. And it's one of the great things having the time to read and understand why crime occurs. Because most of the police officers walking around won't have the level of knowledge that you will. So, anyway, we were sat at Lancaster University one day, just watching the sort of plants go outside the window, thinking, what should we do for our next research project? And the World Cup was coming up. This was back in 2010. And there was a discussion about how domestic violence was increasing in the World Cup. Now, when we looked at these reports, and it was on the radio, and there was a couple of things in the newspaper, what was very apparent was none of these reports quantified it. So they didn't say it was going up by this, and more importantly, they didn't say what they were going to do about it. So I then started to have a look to see what studies had been done about it, and amazingly, no study had previously been done on the association of the World Cup and domestic abuse. So what I then needed was a willing student. So I said to my undergraduate class, does anybody want to do some research around this? Unfortunately enough, somebody did. A great student called Rosalie O'Flaherty. So you can imagine Rosalie's background. Anyway, so what Rosalie started to do was to bring all the studies together. Now, as we sat talking about it, we thought, you can see how there can be an association. So, for example, football has a long association with violence and aggression. Anyone know when football started?
1878.
When?
1878.
13th century. Amazing. Yeah. See, that's your first Trivial Pursuit fact. Just to prepare you for that Christmas board game. Okay, yeah, 13th century. And even from those days, people used to come together and start kicking each other. You know, let's forget about the ball, let's carry on with the game sort of thing. So, since that time, especially across Europe, Europeans have got this thing about football and violence, which mainly occurs around the stadiums, in the physical environment around the stadiums. So, football, generally speaking, has a long association with violence anyway. And the other thing we found was, well, I don't know, you probably don't stereotype as badly as me, but American football, which I thought was all sitting in big stadiums, sort of passing the peanuts and the popcorn around, American football has seen a rise as well in violence. So there was an interesting study which looked at college games, so not even the professional games, college games over 6 seasons, and found an increase in assaults and disorderly behaviour and arrests in that area. So we thought, well, football generally is associated with violence. So then what we started to do was to look at the studies around the causes for violence anyway, and domestic abuse. Now, this is a sort of a picture of Phil when he was a lot younger. The studies around violence and domestic abuse normally fall in 2 categories. So the first one is around individual or psychological explanations, and the other one is around socio-cultural, socio-structural explanations. So let's look at this first one. Basically,
There are many explanations, but one perhaps this shows is social learning. So I don't know if anybody's done Bandura and the Bobo doll? Yes, no? Yeah? Yeah. Well, this is social learning theory and Bandura. So basically the argument goes that if you are brought up in an environment where you're constantly seeing violence and aggression around football and around the house, you will grow up in more likely, or there's more risk that you will also engage in violence. And so that experience of learning behaviour through others leads to a cycle of violence. Now, there's many other psychological explanations for violence, which I won't bore you with, but it's often associated with mental health problems, especially post-traumatic stress disorder. It's associated with depression, but mainly it's associated with emotional and the inability to control your emotions. And I remember as a psychology student, probably about 103 years ago now, frustration was a big thing with violence. So frustration leads to aggression. Okay. So let's just take a brief look at the social structural explanations. So back in the late 1800s, criminology was often dominated by psychological explanations, and then with the rise of the Chicago School in the late 1800s, 1900s, it became more sociologically based. So, using these explanations, people would explain domestic abuse through the imbalance in relationship between men and women. So often men, frustrated by whatever reason, will improve their self-esteem by reinforcing their position in the world against females. So one quote, which I think sums it up, says that it's lashing out at a partner can be used to exert expressions of masculinity or release the pressure of male inadequacy generated through unemployment, poverty or everyday stresses. And what we've seen is there's been a rise of domestic abuse in times of depression, and that is a well-found finding. So, what we've got is football, which is associated with lots of aggression and violence, and we also start seeing domestic abuse, and we can see, we can start to piece together how the two could be associated. Now, just as we were thinking about doing our study, another study was published, again around American football. And this was really clever, because what they did was they looked at domestic abuse, male on female, in the home. So this was the first study of its kind. And they followed the professional games in the United States, and they found that there was a 10% increase, male on female abuse, on what they called upset losses. So this was a really smart thing to do. They checked the betting on the NFL games, so when the home team was expected to win, if they in fact lost, they could show a correlation with increased domestic abuse. And that was a study which was published in 2011. And they also found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the behaviour of domestic abuse was concentrated at the end of the game. So when it appeared more and more likely that their home team was going to lose, so the incidents started. And also they were even more pronounced for bigger games. But there are other things that we thought could be associated as well. And we started to think the World Cup tournament was like a perfect storm for domestic abuse coming together. because you will know as well as I, alcohol has got a very close relationship with violence, and especially domestic violence. One study said that it was a contributing factor in 36% of all domestic abuse cases. So big association. And as you will remember from the World Cup, I'm sure you were there in front of the screen, what you will see either side of the football games is big promotions in terms of alcohol. And if you go into Blackburn Town Centre, I'm sure they'll have televised the games on big screens in some of the public houses, trying to sell as much alcohol as they possibly could. Also, there was some other associations. There was we found quite an obscure study in the United States, which showed that program preference disputes between partners are greatest when watching televised sports. So I don't know if you've tried to snatch the remote control off your partner when there's a sports game on, but this study in the United States said that the biggest arguments are around somebody wanting to watch a sports game and others not wanting to, the partner not wanting to. And then the other series of studies we found is the day of the week. So we found that domestic violence occurs most frequently on weekends and on exceptionally warm days and on major holidays. Anybody any idea why? Alcohol? Yeah, what they use the term actually in some of these studies like drinking holidays. So some events are seen as a holiday for drinking.
You're spending more time together?
That's it. It is. Routine activity theory. So when people are off on weekends and on holidays, they spend more time together. So probability is that they will spend more time having fun together and also more time arguing together, dependent on the relationship. Okay. So the World Cup, we thought, was probably an established drinking holiday for many, and because, as you all know, it's always in June, we get all that hot weather in the UK, which will keep us outside more. So, what methodology did we use? Now, one of the biggest problems with trying to monitor domestic abuse is whether it's reported. So we've got a great researcher at Lancaster called Sylvia Walby, who puts a lot of effort into domestic abuse. And she would argue that only about 24% of domestic abuse incidents get reported normally. So we thought, well, is that sufficient to do our study on? So what we did was, we actually just went to Lancashire. And what we did was, we asked them how they recorded their incidents of domestic abuse. And what we got was some reassurance that the way they recorded them hadn't changed much since the Home Office had put a real priority on it, and that was 1990. So with the advent of domestic violence officers. So we said, right, okay, we'll just take data from Lancashire, and we looked at 3 World Cups, which you can see there, 2002, 2005 and 2010. But we also looked at the years either side just to see what particular trend was occurring. And we looked at year, week, day and match. Now, so we get the statistics and we keep looking at these numbers, and we were doing sort of pretty basic statistical tests. And for anybody who's particularly interested in statistical tests, we use Poisson regression. Now, I have to say, at one stage I sort of went blank, started dribbling a bit. I'm thinking these statistical tests aren't sophisticated enough. Because one of the problems we had was that one day the sun would be shining and the next day it would be raining. One of the matches would be on a weekend, one of them will be on a weekday. So we needed more sophistication, and so I went to a professor of statistics and said, what would you use? And he recommended this statistical test, which can deal with this variability in the data. So we looked at the three most recent tournaments and basically crunched the numbers. Now, we found two particular trends. Actually, I don't know if anybody remembers. Does anybody remember how the tournaments went? How far England got in each of the tournaments? So just so you can relive the moments.
2006 were plus 16.
So the first one hosted by Korea and Japan. We kicked off on the 2nd of June against Sweden, and it was an exciting draw. On the 7th of June, we met Argentina. You can imagine in 2002, that was a big match, and England won. Then the final group stage, we played against Nigeria, and it was another exciting draw. We managed to get through. We then played Denmark, who we won, and then we got knocked out to Brazil. Okay, so 2006, we played Paraguay, started off with a win. We then played Trinidad and Tobago. We won again. By this time, we could see that trophy in our cabinet. Then, with all that euphoria sort of rising, we then played Sweden and drew. So we got through to the next stage, played Ecuador and won, and then we played Portugal and lost. I think that was the game where did Rooney kick Ronaldo or somebody? He got sent off. Yeah. And then South Africa, we played the United States and drew. We played Algeria and drew. And then we played Slovenia and won. And then, I don't know if anybody remembers this, the big match in the next round against Germany. Remember Lampard's goal, which was disallowed? See, I can sense the frustration already in the room. So that was how the three tournaments went. So we crunched all the numbers and we saw two trends. So the first trend we saw was a tournament trend. And unfortunately, we saw an increasing number of domestic abuse incidents across each tournament. So in 2002, there were 64 incidents on average, 2006, 78, and in 2010, there were 99 incidents a day on average. Now, can anyone think a reason for that? Can anyone think of an explanation? I thought two.
More reporting.
More reporting, yeah. So basically, the message for domestic abuse victims to report domestic abuse has finally got through, and there hasn't been any change in behaviour. It's just that there has been an increase. Now, what we also did to try and triangulate our findings was we did interviews with staff at centres that took in domestic abuse victims, and they had a different opinion, although we couldn't say that it was statistically significant because we hadn't followed them across the three tournaments. But they felt that the commercialisation of the World Cup was increasing every year, and more emphasis was being put in it, and the media had also helped to increase the tension across the tournaments. So, from that small sample of people we asked, they actually thought that it was the actual incidents were increasing, although there is still the possibility that it's just increased reporting. Okay. The second trend was that we saw a match trend. So this was, I don't know if anybody saw any of the publicity that came in the 2014 World Cup, but domestic violence was seen to rise 38% when England lost. So that is a massive increase. So when England play and they lose, the domestic abuse incidents rose by, on average, 38%. But unlike the American football, where it really only rose when it was an unexpected loss, domestic abuse even increases when the team win or draw. So, and that's 26%. Okay, and it's also, there's more probability that it'll rise if they play on a weekend. And the biggest rise is when they actually get knocked out. So you can imagine the England versus Germany game, that was played on a Sunday. So whereas on average there were 99 incidents of domestic abuse reported, that Germany game there were 140 incidents reported on that particular game. Okay. So it's you can start to predict when the most domestic abuse cases will be, and it's like that perfect storm. The last game when they get knocked out, especially if it's played in a weekend, and especially if it's if the weather is good. Okay. We also saw one other statistically significant finding, and that domestic violence also rose by 11% the day after England played. Can anyone think of a reason for that? Hangovers. Yeah. Do you know, I hadn't thought of that one actually. Yeah, you could be right. Yeah. Any other ideas?
Sorry, can you repeat?
So basically, England played and domestic abuse increases, but the following day it also increased by 11%. So they weren't playing, but it was the day after.
Okay, maybe it was that state of euphoria that condensed once come.
We're not carry on from the previous argument there as well.
We did it
Yeah.
with Partics on the day after.
They what, sorry?
We did it with Partics on the day after.
See, I was thinking that, and I was thinking that, but I can also see how a hangover and it carries on from the day before. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else got a good idea? Could do with. Yeah. So all these hypotheses really were the next stage in terms of research. Because with any research, you always think, oh, what's the next stage? Okay. So this information, because it was the first published peer-reviewed study, and it was just it was published just before the 2014 World Cup. It sort of took off really. So I was doing interviews with people from all over the world. So South Africa, Italy, France, everybody was interested in terms of this research. And that's the great thing with research. When you find an answer that nobody else has found, it's just such a great feeling. So Rosalie was who'd left the university by this stage. We sort of kept her informed of all the places that her name was like the Bangladeshi Times and stuff like that. We were sending her the clippings. Okay, so with this information, what do you think you can do with it? What's the point of the information? I always think the big question with research is so what?
To prevent it.
Yeah, good. So, I don't know if you'll have done this, but can anyone think of a criminological theory that can be used to prevent domestic abuse? Unfair question, but that's in my personality, I suppose. Anyone? Right, has anybody heard of rational choice theory? Yeah. So why didn't you mention it then? Okay, So rational choice theory basically means that people who offend make rational choices. So they might be on drugs, or they might be on alcohol, or they might not be thinking particularly impressively, but at some flawed way, they will balance the reward they get from the action against all the downside, the risk. So if somebody's thinking of assaulting their partner, what do they get from it? So some studies would argue they get a release of that frustration, they get an increase of that self-esteem. Now, they will only get that benefit if they don't go to prison, or everybody ridicules them for what they've done. So there are 5 different ways that rational choice theory can be put into practice. One of them is to increase the effort, so increase the effort of actually committing the offence. And that's the best example is more acquisitive crime. So if you've got a lot of thefts from a car park, you build the biggest fence you can around the car park, that sort of thing. The other one is increase the risk of detection. The other one is remove excuses. The fourth one is reduce provocation, and the fifth one is reduce reward. So what we saw at that time were lots of agencies coming together with efforts to try and increase the risk of detection. So they were putting more resources in place at the time of the World Cup, with more helplines to report it. We were seeing lots of efforts to try and remove the excuses of domestic violence. And probably if there was a world competition in worst puns, the World Cup would probably win that competition. Again, reduce provocation. There were efforts trying to try and curb the excessive drinking which was associated with it, but they didn't seem to work particularly well. And then also reduce reward. There were lots of messages going out to try and reduce any projected self-esteem from domestic abuse. Okay, so there were lots of great initiatives put in place to try and reduce domestic abuse in the 2014 World Cup. But the English football team put the best initiative to reduce it that anybody has ever seen. And that was to get knocked out and not progress past the group stage. And with that selfless action, the England football team probably reduced many thousands of incidents of domestic abuse. Okay, so what did we learn from this study? Well, my student learned you can take any subject so long as you think about it, and you just start to think how you can get the information, and you can go and ask anybody you want in terms of how to put the methodology together. That student put together some basically world-leading research. So that was the big thing that came from it. The outcome of the research showed that there is an association between televised football and an increased reporting of domestic abuse. Now, when you think of it was only a small study, but when you think of the ramifications, so the World Cup is watched by an estimated 1 billion people across the world. So if that study was to be replicated around the world, we would be talking tens of thousands of incidents of domestic abuse. And it seems to me FIFA should take some sort of responsibility for that. The second thing was, because they're hosted in the summer months, they can create an environment where it will actually increase the number of incidents. And it will be interesting if the World Cup that is possibly going to be played in Qatar, if it is played in the winter, from a sort of a study point of view, whether that would reduce the incidence of domestic abuse anyway. But I think that question, so what, that's the big question. So the knowledge allows situational crime prevention technique to be targeted during the critical periods to reduce the levels of abuse. I always think situational crime prevention, it's only as good as your imagination. So whereas you said, oh, it could be the hangover or it could carry on from the night before, you see, a bit of a dumbo like me, I hadn't thought of those things. And when you start thinking about things and start creating opportunities, you can think of ways where situational crime prevention techniques can be used in more imaginative and innovative ways. Okay, that's me. Any questions? Yes, at the back, and then one.
The figures what you showed
Yes.
were then male onto female.
Good question. In fact, the reviewers asked that question, and I couldn't say for individual incidents. So what I'd really have liked to have done was to split it up on the days England played. All I could say is there was about 11% female on male incidents. But it just generated so many more questions, because what we didn't get from the data was any understanding about the dynamics when it started, you know, the seriousness of or the level of the abuse, should I say, not the seriousness. So there were lots of things which we'd planned to follow up in the 2014 World Cup.
But it would have been interesting to find out if it's cultural,
Yeah.
if it's on same sex,
Yes.
and everything. It'd be quite interesting
Yeah.
to see how further it could go.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was thinking, I don't know what you think, I was thinking, because we do live in such a multicultural society, so we might have, well, I have students on my criminology course from Bulgaria. If they're playing, actually I don't know if they made it into the World Cup, but say they did. If they were playing Slovenia or somewhere they had a big rivalry with, whether, you know, if they were watching it in a bar in Lancaster, whether that would be an issue. So you're right, there's all sorts of questions you can ask about it. And the better your information, the more you can prevent it, definitely. Yeah, sorry, you had a question at the front?
Doesn't violence increase anyway when when people play football and teams lose? It's not just domestic abuse, is it? Because obviously there's a lot of, you know, obviously hooliganism and
Yes.
just various, you know, criminality going on when football is being played anyway, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. But basically that violence is around the stadium. In fact, there was a study done on the 2010 World Cup, and I think casualty admissions went up around something about 25-30%. But so I suppose the big difference we're saying is that violence does increase around the stadium, but it's the power of remote viewing. So the game's going on in Brazil or South Africa or whatever, you can be watching it and it can change your behaviour in your front room. Yeah. And the other thing, actually, I'd sort of mention on that is that you can watch. Obviously, people were watching a lot of football over that period. It was only when England played that we saw these spikes. Yeah, perhaps watching France is sort of soothing. I don't know. Yeah.
Were you able to ascertain if alcohol was the feature of the attendance?
No. To be honest, you sort of go, you get really excited with your data because you think, oh, it's showing this, and this, and then you write it up and you send it to the reviewers, and they will ask good questions like this. So we went back, especially on alcohol, because we thought there'd be alcohol markings, but it was so inconsistently recorded that we
couldn't say with any certainty. Yeah, I mean, you would think intuitively that there'd be a big association with it. Sorry? Yeah.
I was just thinking the correlation you said about the weather.
Yes,
I mean, traditionally in this country, if we have a riot or civil unrest, it's in the summer.
it is.
It doesn't happen in the cold weather.
It is.
These things.
Cold, it's not there.
No.
Fashion shop windows open.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right.
I was just wondering if the violence in the football league, domestic violence from football in the domestic arena is less in the winter. Of course, we haven't got any football this summer except
No.
the Cup, so
No. Well, do you know, I had a student who did a master's study on the weather and crime generally. And it's amazing how many people have studied it. And you're right, violent crime especially peaks in. And it's somebody did a study, and it was something like 3 degrees more than the average. So it wasn't just a hot day; it had to be hotter than the average day for that particular period, and violence increased. But you're right. I think something else is going on with football. It's this sort of in-group, out-group, and studies have argued that a loss of your team is like a personal loss. You feel that loss. So I think there's lots of things going on with football, but when you're watching it remotely as well, lots of those emotions get transmitted through the television and into your home, especially if you're arguing over the remote. Yeah.
Just to carry on from what the lady at the front said, recent statistics have shown that the link between alcohol and advertising during a televised football match is that somebody watching a televised football match will see over 111 references to alcohol in one match.
Yeah.
Did you look any further into, or do you plan to look any further in how that increases with big tournaments like the World Cup?
Well, what we started to do actually, because
So
when
the bog standard Premiership
yeah,
game,
yeah,
that's 111.
yeah,
How much does it go up? With
Yeah.
all the conscientious advertising that's going on from them to try and reduce it, like you said,
yeah.
to what extent are they actually trying to do that?
Well, they're not, and the reason is there is so much money in it. I have to say because we put this study up and they started to go into the drinks companies to ask them questions, and it's all about, as you say, the ethical marketing of the. But we started to pay more attention to it, and you can't get into Tesco with World Cup ones without stumbling over the crates of Carlsberg or whatever. And the amount of manufacturers who want football sponsorship at the time, it is a massive business.
It overpowers government policy
Yeah.
to that extent. And what readings of the British Medical Journal show of what was attempted with minimum unit pricing and linked advertising and responsible advertising was very, very quickly pulled back because of the power that they have.
Sounds like a good dissertation subject.
What would you like to see done in the future to perhaps prevent the domestic violence? Like she just said, advertising alcohol so much is like can be a contributing factor to it, but there's a lot of money in it.
Yeah.
So do you think there's anything realistic that could be done that you'd like to see happen?
Yeah, I would like to see more names, big names in football, come out and denounce it. Because we've seen with the NFL, haven't we, that some of the players have actually been involved, and it's the response of FIFA and everybody else. I was expecting FIFA to come out and say something, but they didn't. They sort of kept their heads down. So I would like to see a very clear denunciation of that domestic abuse. I always think that if you're making so much money, I think the same with the drinks people,